I think we're going to start approaching the point soon where I will need to start to pivot on my stance when it comes to the federal response to the riots across America. Of course, in particular, the riots in Portland. Now, so far, I've been very satisfied with what the federal government has done. They've been very measured. They've not tried to civilize these cities or whip them into shape. They have simply stood their ground at their own facilities and have, tried to deter people who will come and trying to do them harm. They've erected barricades, things like that. They're putting out fires on the sidewalk. They've been, shooting some tear gas out of the windows at people who come too close to their building. All very fair things. The defense of federal property. I have no problem with federal law enforcement doing that. In fact, that's the only thing that any entity such as federal law enforcement should do, except for maybe police, a federal territory like the District of Columbia. Other than that, I see no use for federal law enforcement. They shouldn't exist. That's why we have, state and municipal law enforcement. And it's quite interesting that, this whole time that the feds have been, very limited and only sort of staying in their sandbox, not going out, staying in their house, and keeping people from burning that down. The left has been accusing them of, essentially being an occupying army, coming in to these cities where they're not welcome and just laying down the law, when in reality they have not done that up until this point. Now, it's very possible, and the way that Trump is talking, it sounds like they will be in the near future, actually be doing that. Trump seems to be, with these two operations he's announced. There was one of them was Operation Legend, and then there was another one with a different name. I can't remember. But essentially, he's sending in federal law enforcement to actually just police crime in these cities. And this is something that I've always been against. I think that it's very dumb that we have such a thing as the FBI. In fact, I think the FBI is unconstitutional. There's a reason why it didn't exist, until after World War II. For the most part, I think it might have existed in some form before World War II, but only for a few years. But in reality, the FBI, as we know it today, being a federal police force, has only existed, for a relatively less than half, let's put it that way, of our country's history. It is only in the post-war era that federal policing ever became acceptable, and I never, have thought that this was a good thing. So, I would be happy to see the left actually opposing, these sorts of developments in our country. It's a little late, we've had federal policing for decades in this country, but hey, if they come around to it now, I'd be happy about that. But unfortunately, the left has cried wolf in this case. They've gotten so mad about what about the very, the very tepid response to the violence in Portland by the federal government that, to where you force someone like me, who doesn't think the FBI should even exist, who doesn't think the federal government at this point should exist. I think it's obsolete. I would very much be happy if the federal government went poof and went away. But even I have had to defend the feds against the, the hyperbole of the left over the last couple weeks. And so because of that, what I would argue actually is federal overreach that probably will be occurring in the, in the weeks to come, that the administration will be engaging in. People aren't really going to be having any of that. They're not going to believe the left at this point. It's kind of like how the left ruined the term racism. They're, you can't, if you call everybody a racist, then nobody's a racist. And so they're doing the same thing when it comes to federal overreach. If everything is federal overreach, nothing is federal overreach. The left doesn't know how to distinguish the feds defending a courthouse that they own, their own property. They don't know how to distinguish that from the feds displacing local law enforcement and taking over, the policing of local crime. And of course, the reason for this is that the left has never really cared about this as an issue anyway. I've never heard leftists, maybe I'm mistaken, but I've never heard leftists, call for abolishing the FBI. I know Ron Paul was saying that back in the 1980s, saying we should get rid of the FBI. But there haven't been too many leftists that have been calling for abolishing the FBI because they don't think that that's within the federal government's constitutional purview. I think that the left is, would be very happy to have a centralized secret police force, which is what the FBI is, They're just like the FSB in Russia, or I believe it's the MI5 in Britain, and I can't remember the name of the Israeli equivalent of the FBI. But anyway, a lot of countries have these domestic, national police agencies, and they're hardly ever friends of liberty, at least, when compared to local policing, which, there's a very long tradition in the Anglo-American, legal history of having, local law enforcement that is accountable only to the local citizens and not to the central government. That's why we have sheriffs, which were the reeves of the shire. Shires, in English political division terms, is a very small, unit. And so the idea is that, if you had a shire, or a reeve of the shire, a sheriff, who ran the law enforcement for a small area, he could do it much more fairly than, say, someone who was sent from London by the king, who didn't know anything about the local traditions or the local area or the people or anything like that. You wanted law enforcement to be a local issue. Now, of course, the excuse that the federal government has, which is quite reasonable from I think from a normie standpoint, from someone who's not, deep into political theory and happens to, be steeped in the same traditions as I am, I think it's very reasonable for someone to look at the situation in cities like Portland, where the local police have stood down, where the local police are not doing their job, where they are just allowing these cities to burn. It's easy to look at that and say, like, well, if they're not doing anything, then, well, of course we'd welcome the feds to do that. And because of that, I think it's probably a smart political move at this point for Trump to send in the feds to try and crack down on these lawless cities. But what I would much rather see from Trump is for him to come out and explain what I've just been saying about why law enforcement is supposed to be a local, issue, and how the response to all of this is you throw out the people who have poorly managed, your law enforcement agencies. You throw out, your city council people who and the mayor who appoint the police commissioner and run the police department, or your sheriff if you live in an unincorporated part of America. And you should elect someone new who will, do their job if, in fact, the local people do feel that, their elected officials are not serving their interests. That's what Trump should be saying. He should be saying, hey, it's not my job to stop Portland from burning. I'm just protecting, our federal property, but, whatever happens to the rest of the city is the business of the city and the state. This is not a hard concept to explain. Trump could come out and do it in one speech. But of course, Trump's not a real deep political thinker when it comes to stuff like that, so I don't think he ever would. But I'm just saying that's what I would do in his position. And so if he's not doing that, well then obviously I disagree with his approach. But I can't much hope for a better, a better position or a better stance from the president at this point, because the Fed has, or not the Fed, the slip of the tongue there, the left has really backed him into a corner on this. It would be politically negligent of him, I think, at this point, not to take advantage of the opportunity that they've given him by acting like deranged lunatics. Now, what will the result of all this be? I think that if we do see an increased federal presence in these cities, that will feed into the left's narrative of, Trump being a dictator who's seizing control of these cities and whatnot. And so it will harden their position, but at the same time, I think it will reassure a lot of people and will and helps Trump, Trump sort of build up a more Nixonian image, which, he tried to do back in 2016. He tried to run essentially like Nixon, and I assume that has to do with the influence of Pat Buchanan. And even though Trump has been seen as a chaos agent, he's now trying to be the law and order guy, which is very difficult because those two things don't go together, being both the chaos agent and the law and order guy. But when it looks like, the only way that Trump can pull this off is if he can portray the establishment as being, against law and order. And again, the left is very much helping him with that, even though these are not the kind of leftists that would vocally endorse Joe Biden. Of course, they even denounced the mayor of Portland, who's been very supportive of them. it's hard for normie voters to really distinguish the two. And so when they're, if they do see these images on TV of folks in Portland, just going nuts and burning things, they're going to associate that with the left in general. And these people have been mainstream based on what I've been seeing on Twitter with the resistance folks, who of course are not a majority of the electorate or anything like that, but they're a much more mainstream segment of the left than the far left types. And I don't like using the term far left, but I think you know what I mean. So Trump's predictable response probably will enrage the left further, because this is exactly, what they want him to do in their head to justify everything that they think about him. And in doing so, I think that the riots will in fact escalate. Now, a lot of the mainstream media was blaming Trump for saying, "Oh my gosh, Trump's, or the DHS's or whoever, the marshal's response to the rioters made the riots worse." And it's like, well, that might be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they did anything wrong in principle. That just means that people were enraged by it. That doesn't mean that their emotions are necessarily something that we should agree with. And continuing off of that theme, I think that it will awaken a lot of people's emotions. And so if we continue this narrative that Trump is building up federal forces, sending out his occupying army across America, well, then you're probably going to see more and more anti-fascist mobs springing up and rioting in cities across America. And this will all serve as a prelude to the November election. Essentially, these two sides are feeding off of each other, and I don't mean two sides as in Republican and Democrat. I really mean sort of Trump and the rioters. The riots prompt Trump to act, and Trump's actions prompt the rioters to act. And so this feedback loop, just like a tit for tat, like we might be seeing with China and the U.S. with the closing of these consulates in Houston and Chengdu, respectively, we may see the same thing domestically as perhaps other federal courthouses start being targeted in other cities, and we see maybe more of a national movement of rioting like this, because what we're seeing in Portland is no longer just far leftists. It's much more mainstream people. There's too many people in the streets to just be far left types who are extremists or self-described anarchists. Or just the commies. You have your mainstream resistance crowd now, which is a big part, of the Democratic Party. And so, if all these riots go from being an Antifa type of movement or an Antifa type of thing to a hashtag resistance type of thing, if it's successfully co-opted or perhaps unintentionally co-opted, well then. I can only predict that things will, of course, get worse from here. And I do hate that this is, such a left-right sort of issue. I wish that, if we were seeing citizens come to blows with the federal government, it would not be over left-right issues. I would hope that, it would be both left and right standing up against the federal government. But now we have the right-wingers finding themselves on the side of the federal government because, of course, they are the ones who are against the left at this point. And even people who, like me, who have a natural aversion to the federal government, look at the other side in this binary contest and say, well, I definitely don't want to be with them. So, I guess the feds are my guys. It's not a very comfortable position to be in. I would hate to think that, at the end of the day, if victory, so-called, over the anti-fascist mob looks like a highly centralized America with a highly centralized police force, maybe even a full police state, which, keeps us safe but also unfree. In other words, all of the left's hysteria about Trump being a dictator may not be true of Trump, but, it may be in some ways a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that they accelerate America's decline or into, a highly oppressive state. Now, of course, even if that's where the direction that the state is moving, I don't think that that is sustainable for reasons that I've outlined in the past. Because of divisions in America, the more centralized America gets, the more conflicts it creates. And, eventually, if the federal government tightens its grip too much, the unrest will become too much for the feds to handle. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.